Tonight's speaker is Michael Hauser. He's the marketing manager for the Michigan Opera Theater at the Detroit Opera House. He's the co-author of several history books from Arcadia Publishing, including 2 on tonight's topic. He'll be speaking to us this evening on Hudson's, the grand dame of Detroit retailing. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hauser.
Thanks, Gary. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be up here tonight. Happy to see a great crowd. How many of you worked at Hudson'S? Okay, which stores?
Downtown.
Downtown?
Downtown.
Northland? Eastland? Anybody else?
Pontiac and Northland.
Pontiac, Northland?
I wanted all of those.
I think we all did. Well, this time of the year, of course, evokes all sorts of holiday memories, especially the downtown store. The downtown store actually began in 1881 at the old Opera House, which sat on Campus Martius, where the blockwork CompuWare is today. And Hudson'S actually took the place of Newcomb Endicott and Company, which is a department store that many people have forgotten about. That was actually Michigan's first department store. Most people just refer to it as Newcomb's. And they originally were on Jefferson, which originally is where a lot of our retailers were, then moved to the old Opera House. They moved out, Hudson'S moved in. Hudson'S started initially as a men's and boys store. And after several years of growth, they moved across Woodward to Woodward in Michigan, roughly where some of you might remember where Sanders was, right next to where the First Federal was for a number of years. More growth. Then in 1891, they bought property at Farmer and Gratiot. Now everybody at that time thought that Mr. Hudson was a little crazy to be locating there, a long block over from Woodward. And at that time it was a little bit off the beaten path. But he built an 8-story, almost block-long edifice called the Big Red Store. That building outgrew itself by 1910. Now he always wanted frontage on Woodward Avenue, the 1200 block that we later knew as the big store. But at that time, there was a church on that block and there were other retailers. The Hill & brothers owned a number of parcels on that block as well. So from 1910 to about 1917, they kept buying these slivers of parcels and eventually taking those over and expanding into that, so that by 1923, they could demolish that 1891 building and build a 16-story addition, which would have been on my right here. This would have been a 16-story addition. So that opened in 1923. Then, by 1927, they bought out Newcomb's. By that time, Newcomb Endicott had moved to Grand River in Woodward. They had a 12-story building and a 4-story building going through from Woodward to Farmer Street. And that was located just north of this building here. So Hudson'S bought them out in 1927, demolished all of their buildings, and then put up the big tower addition, which was an L-shaped addition to the building. So by 1928, when this whole complex opened, you had 2 million square feet of space spread out over 32 levels. Because for those of you who worked there, you remember there were half floors, like the 15.5 floor, the 21.5 floor, and then you had various mezzanines. I mean, most of the public remembers the mezzanine, where we went to buy books, went to the pharmacy, bought records there. But then there were also mezzanines above 15. There was a mezzanine above the 3rd basement. So you had several mezzanines. So 32 levels in the building altogether. 51 passenger elevators, 17 freight elevators. It was the single biggest installation of elevators that Otis ever put into a single building. Now, the company, of course, grew by leaps and bounds through the years. Mr. Hudson, who began the company, of course, unfortunately died in 1912, so he never was really able to see the fruits of his labor. But he had been mentoring his 4 nephews, the Weber brothers, Richard Weber, Oscar Weber, James Weber. They really propelled the company into what it became. The expansion, adding lines, and later on, opening branch stores. In 1924, the Weber brothers also established the Hudson Weber Foundation, which still exists today, which has doled out literally millions of dollars in grants to children's organizations, women's organizations, arts and culture, and nonprofits throughout Michigan. In fact, Joe Hudson Jr., who is still with us today, who was a great-grandnephew, is still a trustee of that foundation, still has an office down on 4th Street. And actually he's still active with the Detroit Artists Market, and also did a number of appearances this past spring. I don't know if any of you went to the Junior League Designer Show House this year, which was at the Oscar Weber Mansion on Lakeshore Drive. That home at one time, of course, had a number of parcels on Weber Lane there. There were like 4 parcels from 1 block up all the way down to Lakeshore Drive. But of course, because the house was so expensive to maintain in later years, they sold off the different lots. But and unfortunately, the last 3 owners of that home too have foreclosed on it. So this was an opportunity to open up the house again and try to sell it. And so we did a lot of displays in the house for that. Joe and his wife Jean came to several of the open houses there to help raise funds. The company had such a huge command of our market. You know, we had competition. We had Crowley's, we had Kearns, we had Sam's, and we had branches of Sears and Montgomery Ward and J.C. Penney. But nobody could ever come close to the market share that Hudson's had. Hudson's biggest competition was none of those stores. It was their basement store, which was the largest basement store of any store in the country. And when you stop and think of the basement store, which through the years it was called the basement store, it was called the budget store, and then in the 70s it was renamed the Rainbow Store, yes. Which had its own set of buyers and almost just as many departments as the upstairs store. When they opened it was kind of funny, when they opened the Lincoln Park store too, that store was a former People's Outfitting building, and they called it the world's tallest basement because it originally opened as a budget store. And Pontiac originally opened as a budget store before it became a full line store. So their biggest competition was themselves, the budget store. 5% of all pre-tax profits, too, was another thing that Hudson started too. 5% of all those pre-tax profits went back into the communities where they had stores. So in Michigan, eventually there were 23 stores, all of these communities where they had stores. Libraries, museums, schools, all received grants, as a result of that. Target has continued that today. If you have a red card, 5% of what you spend at the company, and Target gives an incredible amount of money back to the community. And that's another thing too, that a lot of folks, if you didn't work there, they don't understand all these different relationships through the years. I'm going to pop in a little video a little bit later, which will explain that in more detail. But Hudson's merged with Dayton's in 1969 to create the Dayton-Hudson Department Store Company. The Webers had been friends with the Daytons for many years. Dayton's in Minneapolis was very similar to Hudson's. They had a huge command of the market. They had a large downtown store, large branch stores, gave a lot back to the community. So it was a natural for the two stores to combine. They still kept separate staffs, separate names. But by 1984, a year after the downtown store closed, they decided to move the corporate headquarters to Minneapolis. And that was sort of like a lot of people felt that was sort of the downfall of the company. Because you still had about 1,200 people working in the downtown building even after the downtown store closed at the corporate office. Then in 1990, they acquired Marshall Field's. So then it was Dayton's, Hudson's, and Marshall Field's. Then in 2000, they dropped the Dayton Hudson Department Store Company name and it became simply Target Incorporated. A lot of people forget that Target was actually begun by Dayton's in 1962, even though they didn't come to the Detroit market until the early 80s. So 2001, obviously stockholders want to make money, and they're not happy with the return on investment from the department store division, despite the fact that Target was putting millions into this division. So in 2001, again, to save money, they decided to drop the Hudson name, drop the Dayton name, and go with what they felt was the strongest of the three, and that was Marshall Field's. So in 2001, then all 62 Dayton's and Hudson's and Marshall Field stores became Marshall Field's. 2001 through 2004, still pouring a lot of money into the division, but not getting the return on investment. Doing great marketing, great merchandising, but as we all know, people's tastes are changing constantly. People are buying online more, they're buying at discount stores more, and it's getting harder and harder for the department store division to make a profit. So it was put up for sale. So in 2004, the company, Target, sold the entire department store division to the May Company out of St. Louis. Similar company, they had stores like Kaufman's in Pittsburgh, May Company, California, May Company, Cleveland. Now, Target knew that May was not a good steward of their own history, so before they sold the company, they moved the archives, which at that time took up the entire 11th to 12th floors of the State Street Marshall Field store, and moved it all to Minneapolis, which was great because they still got in that collection 80 of the brass drinking fountains from the downtown Hudson store, and some of the brass nameplates, and just about everything you can imagine. They've done such a great job of saving all of this memorabilia from the department store division. So that was all moved to Minneapolis. Well, May Company still kept the name Marshall Field, but that only lasted a year. In 2005, the entire company was sold to Federated department stores, which Federated, of course, is Macy's and Bloomingdale's. Macy's did not want to keep any of these local nameplates at any of the stores that they acquired. So by 2006, Macy's went from basically what most of us thought was a New York-based store with a strong presence in California to a national company with 825 stores. So there was still a regional division in Minneapolis. It was called Macy's North, which pretty much controlled our division here. But then, I think about 3 years ago, they decided to relinquish that division. So you've got a huge chunk of space in downtown Minneapolis today that's up for sale where 1,200 people once worked. So it's all about change. The warehouses too. A lot of people forget about the warehouses that Hudson's had downtown on Adams and Brush. You had about 1.5 million square feet of warehousing space. Hudson's was green before we thought about green. They had electric trucks running between the warehouse and the downtown store, going back as far as the 1920s. There was also a warehouse complex on 4th Street, which was where all the parade floats were constructed. There was a warehouse on St. Antoine. There was a warehouse on Clark Street. There was back office space in Harmony Park. So a tremendous amount of square footage devoted to back office and warehousing space through the years. By 1990, though, of course, Ford Field was being planned, and the downtown warehouses were sold for that, and then Target had built a new warehouse near DeQuinder at 696. And so those warehouse sales that we all used to line up for in the cold and ride those big freight elevators for moved out there for several years until that warehousing situation was closed by Macy's. So some of the other remembrances, World War II, very important. Hudson's was one of the top stores in terms of selling war bonds. We got a window display over here. Christmas, of course, nobody could touch them in terms of the elaborate displays on all the floors. And you figure you get 49 windows that were changed weekly for many years. And of course, the Woodward Avenue windows were animated with every couple of years with a different theme. And then of course, you could take an express elevator up to 12, where the real Santa lived. And they were also one of the first stores in the country to have multiple Santas. You may have been in line with your kids thinking, we're going to see the Santa. But little did you know that there were really about 6 Santas in the back. And you also had your choice. You could have a Caucasian Santa, an African-American Santa, or a Hispanic Santa. And then, of course, you were led into the auditorium, because the auditorium was a different theme every year also, by the Pixies. Or you might have been lucky to have Christmas Carol usher you into the auditorium. Christmas Carol was a marketing effort put together in the 1950s by Hudson'S. Christmas Carol was always with Santa at the parade and was right there on the marquee right after the parade to give the key to the city, to the mayor, both Christmas Carol and Santa. Tradition, fireworks. Another great tradition that's still with us today. It was begun by Hudson'S in 1959 for the Freedom Festival between Detroit and Windsor. And those fireworks were carried by Hudson'S for many years, and then of course by Marshall Fields. Of course today that tradition is carried on by Target. Bash Bash, which unfortunately is no longer with us anymore, began back at the Pontchartrain Hotel back in the 1960s and was sponsored by Hudson'S for many, many years, which was a benefit for the Art Institute. In later years, it took on a whole new meaning because they moved it to the Fox Theater and the State Theater, and then they do an afterglow at Comerica Park, and that usually raised between $600,000 and $700,000 each year for the Art Institute. The last time that was here was in 2001. The tradition is carried on today by Macy's. They've expanded it to last year to Los Angeles and San Francisco. Marshall Fields had also expanded it to Minneapolis and Chicago. Bash Bash, though, is a registered trademark to the Art Institute, so they can't use the name Bash Bash. So today it's called Glamorama. So a lot of these traditions that are still with us. The auditorium was another important segment of the Hudson'S. And when you stop and think about it, the auditorium used to have car shows, fashion shows, dog shows, cat shows, you name it. Colleen Moore's Dollhouse used to come to the auditorium every year. Now this actually still exists. It's in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Flower shows at Easter time. Michigan on Canvas debuted there. Michigan on Canvas was another program in the late 1940s. Hudson'S commissioned over a dozen artists from all around the country to do over 100 paintings depicting life here in Michigan. And they also developed special trucks to take all this artwork around the state. It went to just about every single museum and library throughout the state. And then ended its tour after 2 years at the State Fairgrounds and came back to the 12th floor auditorium. And then all those paintings were donated to the Henry Ford Museum. A book that was done on the parade, it's out of print, it's really rare. That was done in 1960. I've also got the Hudsonian magazine, for those of you who work there, was excellent. One of the best in-house magazines of any company in the country. And that was produced from the late teens right on up through the late 80s. And not only news about employees and about the store, but all sorts of news in those magazines about the city. It's literally a chronicle of what happened in this area during that time period. That's a glove tree over there from the downtown store. Of course, women years ago wouldn't be caught dead going downtown shopping without gloves and formal attire. And gloves would be on a counter. There's little brass hands there. The gloves would be fixed to that, and then you would also get a little instructional manual on how to wear those gloves properly. There's a lot of things over here that you would never dream of a department store selling, like soap flakes, cigars, very non-PC today. Note cards, we've got Christmas boxes from the 1930s and the 1940s. This is a a music roll from the Carillon that was on the 20th floor that played music timed to different seasons. You know, this one is for Christmas. They also had a special one for Easter. Advertising, they continually won awards through the years for the best advertising in the country in terms of department stores. Bridal registry, huge. Studio of Interior Design, up to 5,000 homes a year would use this service. And this was a service that if you needed assistance with not only furniture, but carpeting, draperies, color schemes, things like that. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, that department was also eliminated by Macy's. That used to be on all of the branch stores, and as well as downtown. We had a reunion 2 years ago of everybody who ever worked in that department, and about 250 people from all around the country came to the Michigan Design Center. And Susan Kelly greeted everyone who was, for many years, the Director of Community Relations. And we also had a letter that Joe Hudson wrote, because that was a department that he felt very strongly about. He also started the J.L. Hudson Art Gallery, which was on the 7th floor, which was the same floor as the Woodward Shops. And that's where his real interest came from in terms of supporting the Detroit artists market. I mean, at one time, you could even go into that gallery and buy a Picasso. Because if you remember, the 7th floor was always the fancy floor. It was literally like walking into a hotel when you got off the escalator or the elevator. That long corridor of shops. I'm going to pop in a little, this is about a 5-minute video, and this is when Dayton's and Fields came into the mix, and you'll be able to see some of the traditions through the years. Is it queuing up? I can't tell.
Do you need lights again?
Yep. There we go.
Yeah.
Over the years, the faces have changed. And the buildings. Hemlines have gone up and down. Retail, after all, is a business built on change. But from the very beginning, from the first time the name of J.L. Hudson went up on the old Detroit Opera House in 1881, the heart of our tradition has remained the same, serving our guests. Our tradition of guest service is how we built our reputation and warm relationships with generations of guests. At Hudson's, service is an attitude, a thread that runs through everything we do. It shapes the way we treat each other and our guests. It affects the look of our stores and the merchandise we carry. Hudson's tradition of guest service began with what was, at the time, a radical idea, clearly marking the prices on all the goods. Other merchants used a code that guests couldn't read. And rather than keep merchandise put away in boxes, we had it on display in attractive glass front fixtures where guests could see it more easily. Hudson's also offered guests these credit coins, forerunners of the charge cards we use today, so they could make their purchases without having to carry large amounts of cash. We offered delivery service, so our guests wouldn't have to cart around armloads of boxes. And our basement store offered 20 departments of value-priced merchandise, soon becoming the largest store within a store in the country. We offered the fashions guests came to expect from Hudson's. We serve our guests in the way we do business and to our involvement in the community. We are connected to our guests. Their concerns are our concerns. When times are hard, we pitch in. When they're good, we celebrate together. And together, we grow. Dayton's, Hudson's, and Marshall Fields, each with a special place in the heart of the community. We are a family of stores dedicated to fashion leadership and guest service in everything we do. In merchandising, in marketing, in our use of technology, and in the many special events we sponsor. The people of Dayton's, Hudson's, and Marshall Fields offer our guests our very best. Our common traditions are still alive today. Our department stores continue to grow and evolve, providing new opportunities for our people and new ways to serve our guests. There will be new faces and new buildings, but it all comes from the heart of Hudson's, our proud tradition of guest service.
Okay, Hudson's was a little late compared to other retailers with going to the suburbs. I mean, back in the 1920s, Marshall Fields, Bloomingdale's, Lord & Taylor, a lot of other retailers around the country had been building suburban stores, but they were very proud of their downtown store, and they kept building and expanding it and really believed in it. It wasn't until the 1950s when they met Victor Gruen, the famous European architect, that they started to think expansion. Now, originally, Eastland was going to be the first suburban store, but what was then Gratiot Township wasn't quite sure if they wanted development. And there also happened to be a farm on that property too. And that gentleman was pretty firm in his belief that he still wanted his property, and regardless of what happened, he still wanted his parcel. He didn't want to leave that house, and he still wanted a little bit of land in which to farm on. Well, meanwhile, Southfield Township was very eager for development, and so Northland ended up opening first in 1954. Eastland came later on in 1957. Northland was a complete surprise. They knew they were going to do well, but not nearly as well as they thought. I mean, for a while they had to move about 600 people from downtown out to Northland just to handle the crowds. There would be 2-mile backups just to get into the parking lot of Northland. Northland, you have to remember, Northland was the first true regional shopping center built in this country, with that many stores and so many innovations. Some of you might remember, initially when Northland opened too, there was a Kroger in that complex too. Well, the groceries would come right out on a carousel, right to your car. That Hudson store also, even today, is still the largest branch store ever constructed in this country at about 530,000 square feet, spread out over 4 levels. we were really blessed with large branch stores. Eastland, also almost 400,000 square feet. And most of the other branches, whether it was Pontiac, Summit Place, or Southland, Westland, 300,000 square feet. Most apartment stores that are built today are roughly 120, 125,000 square feet. And going back to that basement store too, when you stop and think about the square footage of the budget store downtown, 2 floors, 250,000 square feet, that's the size of a large Meijer, Target, or Walmart today. That was within that building. So the business that store did, the best year was 1952, $150 million in sales. And you put that into today's dollars, you're talking over $500 million a year, just in the downtown store. But by 1982, which was the last full year of operation downtown, that had dropped 40 million. And it was costing over $2 million a year just for air conditioning and heat, which is why you started to see those floors be closed off, or the walls would come in. It was very sad towards the end, especially at Christmas time, if you wanted to go up to Santa or go up to the dining rooms on 13, to have to pass over the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th floors with nothing on them. But the store stayed open longer than it probably should have, because you still had family members involved. Economically, any other company probably would have closed it up decades ago. But they felt very strongly, about the building and about the community and what they were doing with the community. So the store, stayed open until December of 1982. I've got another video that I'm going to pop in. It's another short one. In 1990, the company sold the building to Southwestern Associates, which was a Windsor-based company that wanted to turn the building into a mixed-use development. Office, retail, parking. But it became very apparent after they took the building over that they didn't really have the wherewithal to do that, and started stripping things in the building, and they cut off the fire suppression system. So the 4th basement started to flood. Of course, nobody was notified at the city, the police department or the fire department, and then they had to get court orders in order to be able to get into the building. And, we're pretty horrified at what they saw. But, anything of value, copper, nickel, brass, marble, everything was being stripped out of that building. Well, between 1990 and 1996, they in turn sold the building to 3 other parties. A Detroit-based church said they owned the building. A Grosse Pointe businessman said he owned the building. And an Oak Park architect said he owned the building. Well, nobody's paying taxes. Nobody's paying for security anymore. More and more of the building was being gutted. Wyandot Alarm almost got the building. They had put a lien on the building because they weren't being paid by the Canadians, and they had to go to court. They almost got the building for $35,000. Now, it's rumored that the building was sold to the Canadians for roughly $700,000. So where else in America could you have gone and bought a 2 million square foot building in the middle of a downtown for that kind of money? So, all sorts of stories. Meanwhile, Mayor Archer at the time put together the Greater Downtown Partnership, which was sort of a quasi-governmental agency trying to get to the bottom of this, and then very quietly behind the scenes trying to gain control of the property. Most of course, the businessmen in town, and of course the city officials really wanted the building to come down, because by that time it had, in their eyes, it had become an eyesore. They did not really see the fact that the building really could have become a mixed-use development. But so much of downtown was deteriorating. Once Hudson'S closed, it was like a domino effect, up and down Woodward. Everything else closed. Kresge's, Woolworths, the jewelry stores, the shoe stores, everything. It just became a ghost town. And so there weren't enough dollars to go around to fix up some of these other buildings and trying to get tenants for the other buildings. So they felt, we need to get rid of this so that there's money to go around for the other buildings so that we can convert those to residential and mixed use. So by 1996, the Greater Downtown Partnership got control of the block. A friend of mine was working there at the time, and I said, you know, it's imminent, the building's gonna come down. We need to document this, because it hasn't been documented in a number of years, and once it's gone, it's gone. So we got permission from the Greater Downtown Partnership. I pulled 6 volunteers from Wayne State University, and we spent the next year in the building. We would go to the office on Friday afternoon, get the key to the building, to the loading dock door, and go into the building. And you gotta remember, 32 levels, 2 million plus square feet, in the middle of town. You never know what's gonna happen or what's gonna pop up in front of you. So we never went in without cell phones, and never went in without a weapon of choice, which would have been a crowbar on our sides. Because somebody could pop up even on a Sunday morning in front of you, demanding money. And there were always scrappers in the building. We would hear noises all the time, but never knew where they were coming from. So we worked all 32 levels to pull things together for an exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum. Things that we thought the public would be interested in. Signage that was left behind, photos, counters, marble, pieces of really cool plaster, things like that. All sorts of things. Uniforms, tubes for the tube system, cash tube system. And of course we had to take it immediately the day that we were there. We would go in at sunrise and leave at sunset. And we'd have to take it with us because of people that were living in the building. Because you had all of these illegal I'll call them apartments, where people were living as high up as the 10th floor. Mezzanine level, facing woodward, you had a guy living there who, I swear, probably went out for fast food 3 times a day because there were just mounds and mounds and mounds of trash on that floor. It was really pathetic and sad. Etched windows, too. We had to, get things like that out of there, or some of that beautiful mahogany off of the 2nd floor, which we got for the museum. But we would have to take it the same day we were there because we knew the next time we came, it would be gone. So a year of all of this, and so we filled a 5,000 square foot gallery with all of this in an exhibit, and then that also paved the way for 2 books that we worked on also. So I'm going to pop this in. In conjunction with that exhibit, then we did a couple of videos, one for Channel 7, and then we did another one for the museum, interviewing different people who had worked at the store through the years. And then I also, I didn't have that video to bring tonight, but I did meet, I was telling another gentleman earlier tonight, I met Naaman Clark. Some of you may remember him. He ran the elevator department for a number of years. Naaman started at the company in 1949 as an elevator starter, and then became head of the department. So he had 125 people under him at one time, because the elevator department was also in charge of the escalators, and they were also in charge of, a lot of you probably remember the alley that went right through the middle of the store between the Woodward building and the Farmer building. And he was the first African American in management at the company too. He later retired from the company in the mid-1970s as manager of the credit union. But he had a lot of interesting stories to tell me. I mean, he showed me books. It was called Elevator Phraseology. Correct language on how to speak to customers and visitors to the building. Because the elevator operators not only had to know where everything was in the building in terms of the selling floor, but also all the non-selling departments in the building as well. I think you'll get a kick out of Paul, too. You'll see in this video. Paul talks about the trains. And Paul just happened to be walking through when we were doing this video. And he also was a big fan of Santa Claus.
Eric Smith. Thanks for being with us. As you know, each week at this time, we present a different kind of story about our town. Today, well, a story about a very old tradition. A tradition at Christmas. A tradition about an old building that once housed a very famous department store. A story about Hudson's. A story from the heart.
Buildings know nothing about whether you're rich or poor, black or white, famous or not. It's just something about that building seems to just take in all people. I didn't know nothing about segregation or nothing like that. It's just, you just felt good when you saw it. You just felt good. It was a magic feeling. Just walking by, I could be times I walk by and then go in and just felt drawn to it, like it had a soul or something, saying, come to me, come with me.
In its heyday, this building employed over 10,000 people. And also, we figure in the 40s and the 50s, 100,000 people a day shopped that store.
Well, I can remember as a young kid being there, and this was in the 50s, like one of my aunts who was from the South, we were poor people from the South, we took the bus down, we didn't have a car in town, we took the bus down. And as a kid, you could read people's moods, and she immediately, when we got to Hudson, she changed from being real granny, like I call her, she was Aunt Granny. She got sort of like an air of sophistication about her, and I could feel that in her, so I knew Hudson was something special, and I had to be on my best behavior.
My first part-time job was in 1958 for Christmas holidays after I graduated. I worked in the second basement store. And it was just a treat to work there and watch all the hustle and bustle. And if you needed to boost your Christmas spirits up, Hudson's downtown was the place to go.
When you went to the 12th floor of the toy department, and you were in line going to Santa Claus. I mean, every window you passed was an animated window.
One of the big things, of course, was to go down at night and walk around the building and look in the windows, and the windows were just fairy tale. They had the most fantastic collection of dolls from all over the world, and every size and every price.
Trains ran all over. Not just in one area, they had trains all over the department. And every conceivable kind of toy in those days. And then up at the far end, up at the stage, there he was in his red suit, Santa Claus. And of course, the only true Santa Claus appeared at the 12th floor, where he spent the month of December. And I believe that then, I believe it now.
Sewing hats, making hats and bridal veils, that was my job. I loved it. At Christmas, they were more on different toys and different things, but then they would come down with the children, and then they would pick out the hat, but in a hurry. Children didn't want to wait, you know.
Well, my parents were always involved, my father especially, in doing things, and they even asked him to film the Santa Claus parade. Being the oldest one in the family, I would get the privilege of going with him. Stand out and freeze on the marquee while we took pictures of the Santa Claus parade.
I worked at the downtown Hudson'S store and had an opportunity to meet a young lady that worked over there in the ledgers by the name of June. And in 1958 we were married. And June and I would have 3 children, the first of which was a girl. And we named her Joyce Lynn. So she was Joyce Lynn Handley. And not by coincidence, her initials are JLH.
The old building passed away 15 Christmases ago, but the mystique, the legend of Hudson's downtown has lingered and grown in our heart. And soon the heart will speak from the pages of a book written by one who knows the legend well.
There's a life within the walls of that building. I still believe that it's still alive, and I wanted to help the memories live on for people.
undoubtedly Hudson's has met its demise as far as the building is concerned. But that wrecking ball certainly can't take away the memories, the special memories that I had down there so many years ago. Can't take that away.
You see the word wisdom inscribed in the downtown library. In the shadow of Hudson's, and I'm always saying, where was the wisdom when they decided to tear this building down? Because the building was built not to be destroyed. And then I was thinking the other day, as Dan Gilbert bought yet 2 more buildings downtown, God, if he was only around back in 1998, he would have saved that building. He would have put some high-tech firms into that building, and it would have residents in it and stores, and it's just too darn bad. Talking about the building, I don't know how much this weighs, but this is brass, and if you remember, certain elevators only went to odd-numbered floors, and other elevators only went to even-numbered floors. This one is odd. This goes from the 3rd basement up to the 19th floor, which is where advertising was. If any of you remember, advertising, 125 people working in that department up on the 19th floor. Anybody want to take a guess what this little piece is? It was on the 20th floor. This is a small piece of what was the 2nd largest switchboard in the country, outside of the Pentagon. 35,000 calls a day, an entire wall the size of this room for that switchboard. You all know what a typical screw looks like? Well, this is a Hudson's screw. Lots of beautiful marble throughout the building, all areas of the building. Also, lots of really interesting tile in several areas of the building too. These tiles, they're not Poabic, but they look like Poabic. These were from the employee cafeteria on the 14th floor. A lot of people tend to forget too, up on 14, you also had a store hospital on the farmer end of the building. Now, bricks. Everybody remembers, of course, the red brick that they saw on the outside of the building, which was reinforced a thinner orange-colored brick. Then in the freight lobbies on every floor, you had a glazed amber-colored brick. Then on 13 and 14 in the kitchens and the commissary, you had beautiful white glazed brick. And then on the tower portion of the building, you had rounded bricks with a smoked gloss over it, because these had to be protected because of the high winds on those upper floors. Now, I was also going to pass out a few images here too. Food was really important to retail for many, many years, and still is. If you wanted to dine at the store, of course you had a full-service cafeteria in the 2nd basement, which I'll pass some of these around. You also had a snack bar in the 1st basement, a little orangeade stand in the 1st basement. On the mezzanine, you had a tea room on the Farmer Street side. You also had an incredibly large ice cream parlor on the mezzanine. You had another snack bar on the 4th floor. Then if you wanted fine dining, you went up to 13, and you had 3 dining rooms. You had the Georgian room, the Americana room, and the Pine rooms. Now in 1959, the latter 2 were combined to create the Riverview room, and then the Pine room was used for special events. Later on in the 70s, it became what they called the Beef Emporium. They put a big salad bar in, and then they would turn that into sort of a man cave on the weekend, you know, and have TVs in it for football games and peanuts and beer. And these are, I'll pass these images around. These are some of the dining rooms on 13. This is actually the Pine room here. and the Georgian room. Now, despite the fact that there was a public library right in back of the downtown store, they still had a very successful circulating library on the mezzanine for many, many years. Another fond memory a lot of people have, and I'm telling you, when we were in the building looking for artifacts, we didn't have blueprints of the children's barber shop. We could not figure out where in the heck that was until one day we were on the 4th floor in the Farmer building. We found a photo, we saw the arch, we thought, this is where the children's barber shop used to be. It later became probably the largest ladies' powder room area I've ever seen with 80 stalls. And then there was also a separate little ladies' room for women and children on that same floor. But children's barber shop was on 4 and then later on moved up to 14. Now, the original children's barber shop, this was all put together by Tony Sarge, who created marionettes back in the 1920s. The entire barber shop was constructed at his Greenwich Village studio in New York and then shipped to Detroit. There were 15 circus animals that you could get your hair cut. And then there was a circus tent in another room while you waited. And you could look into the circus tent. It was sort of like stereopticons, and you could see a circus going on. Now, a couple of friends of mine who do auctions and estate sales and stuff like that called me a few months ago and said, we're going to email you an image. We're doing a sale at Hazel Park. Is this what we think it is? And I said, as soon as I got the image, I said, oh my God, that's it. So I contacted the museum and I told them, you have to buy it because it was the moose from the children's barber shop. And so it's been restored and it's in the new Gallery of Culture at the Historical Museum in Detroit that just opened last week. This was the studio of interior design on the 9th floor. Some of you ladies might remember powder blending, tournure. Now, Charles of the Ritz and Helena Rubinstein also had studios in the downtown store. And this is an image of employees at the company in 1889. And of course, at first look, it's like, oh my God, it's all guys. But there actually is one female in here, and there's also one African-American gentleman. And speaking of the beauty salon, there were over 100 folks working in the beauty salon. Initially, the beauty salons were on 7, but in 1948, everything was moved off the 7th floor to create the woodward shops. It was moved up to 14. Over 100 folks in the beauty salon on 14. And I'll pass around some images of Toyland. Now, you know, even, and this is fun too, this is from the 1950s, a Lego window, and of course, Lego will never die. There's a huge exhibit at the Henry Ford right now on Lego. And of course, even right up until the time the store closed, they did not skimp on Toyland. The 12th floor, even the very last Christmas, there was like a carnival with carnival rides and ponies and a children's restaurant. There we go. And of course, in the early years, it took on a different theme. Well, there were a lot of Disney themes through the years too, Pinocchio, things like that. This is that third basement cafeteria. And these two images are that large ice cream parlor on the mezzanine. Now, a lot of folks ask about the flag also. The first time the flag was flown on the downtown store was for Armistice Day in 1923. Then in 1949, it was updated to include Alaska and Hawaii. The last time the flag was flown on the outside of the downtown store was for the bicentennial. In 1976, Hudson'S closed off Woodward, had the Detroit Symphony play for the last unfurling. It took 60 guys every year to put that flag up. The flag was then donated to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian really didn't have the room to display it. It was just too darn big, and so it sat in storage and of course started to deteriorate. They, in turn, sold it to a flag conservator in Texas. And then by the early 90s, the flag was just so far gone that the company gave them permission to destroy it. But in 2003, Target commissioned a brand new American flag, just about the same size, for the Marshall Field's State Street store in Chicago. And so that is still flown today for Flag Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, things like that. And if you're in Chicago during any of these holidays, it's in the north end of the State Street store, and it hangs from the 12th floor all the way down to just above the top of the cosmetic counters. But the type of shopping and retailing and discovery, that we used to enjoy at these downtown stores is really, a bygone thing, unless you live in New York, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco. Most downtowns have very little retail left anymore. I don't think we'll ever live to see what we once had. The Hudson family was so committed, and the Weber family, to our community, giving back so much through the years. And of course, another thing too, you have to remember too, there were generations of family members working at these stores that you don't see that too much today. So there's no real sense of pride anymore. And of course, customer service pretty much has gone out the door everywhere. Well, there are a few instances, and today we don't have anybody sort of like in the middle in terms of retailing like we used to have years ago. I mean, you've got the high end, the Neiman Marcus, the Saks Fifth Avenue, the Nordstroms. And then, you have Macy's. I guess in the middle you pretty much have Kohl's maybe, but then you get into all the discounters. So we don't have people like a Crowley's, a Kearns, and people in the middle anymore like we used to for real middle class people. Does anybody have any questions, or does anybody want to share some of their memories of either working at the store or going to the store?
Was it at one time the tallest department store in the world?
Yes, the question was it the tallest department store in the world? Yes, tallest ever constructed. In terms of square footage, it's just a tad smaller than Macy's Herald Square. Macy's Herald Square is still the largest store ever constructed anywhere. And it's interesting you bring that up because Macy's in New York is undergoing about a $500 million renovation right now. They're restoring parts of the building. They're opening up the windows that have been painted over on the Broadway side. Last month, they just opened the world's largest shoe department, ladies. 300,000 pairs of shoes in stock. And if you don't want to wait, right in the middle of the shoe department is a chocolate and champagne bar. And then up on the 6th floor, they're gutting more space, opening up all of the windows for a sit-down restaurant so that you can sit and look out the window at the Empire State Building. So, and they're actually giving up about 200,000 square feet of back office space to turn over to retail. So when they're done, it's going to be roughly between 1.2 and 1.5 million square feet of that building just devoted to retail. And if you go too, they've also preserved their original wooden escalator in the 7th Avenue building, very similar to what we had at Crowley's downtown.
Did the Hudson's store ever have an organ like the Wanamaker organ in Philadelphia?
No, Wanamaker's in Philadelphia have probably one of the largest Wurlitzer organ commissions anywhere. And they still play that, even though it's a Macy's today. Hudson's never had an organ. They had that Carillon up on 20 that played, for different holidays and things like that.
Yeah. How did you get interested in Hudson's?
How did I get interested in Hudson's? Well, I think probably the first time I was in the store, my mom brought me downtown. 1956, the last year that the Woodward Avenue streetcars were running. And I just became enthralled with it. And I've been in retail most of my life, and it's in my blood. And I just started, probably in the 70s, started saving anything and everything and taking pictures of the building. So, yeah. not by choice, but the museum had a relationship with one of the television stations, and so they wanted artifacts on display, and then they wanted some commentary. It was painful though to listen to all the people cheering, wanting it to come down.
Say that as a young mother in the 50s, the personal shopping and the deliveries would save my life, I swear. It was wonderful.
I've heard so many stories from people that say that they would even deliver a thimble of thread through the years. But you have to remember, they did have substations throughout the entire metro area for deliveries.
50 years ago now, we took the train from Birmingham to downtown Detroit to Hudson's with our 2 children to see Santa Claus.
Does anybody remember the Silver Streak? Originally Grand Trunk ran it, and then SEMTA took it over later on. And it ran from Pontiac, stopped in Birmingham, and Royal Oak, and Ferndale, and New Center before it terminated at Renaissance.
I belong to the Blue Water Chapter of Michigan Historical Society of the Railroad Club, and we were the last bunch of people to ride on the SEMTA train because we performed security for the train. We figured people would start ripping things off and stealing stuff off the cars with these years. So that was pretty neat. We got to do that.
I heard that those cars and locomotives were sold in Long Island Railroad. Is that true?
I heard that they went out east. But the locomotives, they ended up going back to Grand Trunk, their Grand Trunk locomotives.
I mean, it's so ironic that years ago we had one of the best transit systems in the country between the DSR buses, the DSR streetcars, the commuter rail from Pontiac, the interurban trains for so many years. We had all of this, and then we ripped it up and got rid of it. And now we're trying to get this M1 rail thing going, and which, who knows?
Talk about the heating or the cooling of the building. You know, did they use coal at the beginning or natural gas?
There was a question about the HVAC of the building. Was it coal or gas? I do know that it was one of the largest carrier air conditioning systems ever put into a building, and during World War II they actually took one of the huge systems out to go onto an aircraft carrier as part of the war effort.
How did you go about collecting all this stuff? How long did it take you to get what you have on display here?
Okay, well, I've done several exhibits at the museum, at the Historical Museum. I'm always collecting stuff, going to garage sales, and estate sales, and paper shows, and things like that, people's homes, dumpster diving, you name it. Because people throw away everything today, nobody saves anything. You know, collect this stuff, and it really comes in handy because we've also done a lot of displays for, I don't know if you're familiar with the Detroit shop at Somerset?
Yep.
So we've actually got a little slice of the Woodward shops in there. We recreated the carpet, the color, we stenciled the logo on the wall. We changed out a dress or two on a mannequin in there. We've got an original store directory in there. We've also done a Kresge window, a Woolworth window, a Fife shoe window. So a lot of things have come in handy there. We did 2 huge windows last Christmas on Hudson'S at Somerset. So, and then we've also given them things for these pop-up shops that they've been doing downtown in Detroit. So I'm always saving. And anything that I have that's a duplicate of nature, I give to the Target Archives in Minneapolis because they're preserving so much of this. They've spent a great deal of time and money digitizing their entire archives, which is comprised of Dayton's, Hudson's, Marshall Field's, Target, and Mervyn's. So, yeah, because they owned Mervyn's for a number of years also. So, and they're always updating the timeline on the Target website too. And then they've also created public archive, although it changes all the time. You never know what's going to be there or not. At Marshall, well, what was Marshall Field's in Chicago. And then also at what was the downtown Dayton store in Minneapolis. If you go to the 12th floor, there's still a restaurant called the Oak Grill, just like what we had on the 13th floor here, and there's an archive right across from that restaurant that includes things on Hudson's, including one of our brass drinking fountains, brass nameplates, photos, things like that.
My father worked in the major appliance department, and Hudson's would return, you could return anything to Hudson's, even a window air conditioner in the fall.
Yes, I think their return policy was probably a little too liberal. Certainly by today's standards, they'd go broke if everybody brought everything back, because working on the selling floor up until about a year or so ago, I can tell you, the things that you had to take back that you really shouldn't have. If you want to learn more, too, there's a number of resources out there. Laura Rowley did a book called On Target, and there are lots of references to Hudson's in this book. I'm not sure if any of these are in the library here or not. Jane Whitaker wrote a book called Service and Style. Lots of references, not only to Hudson's, but also to Kearns and Crowley's in this book. She also has a website called departmentstorehistory.net. You can go on there and you can ask questions, you can answer questions. In Detroit, all of our stores come up a lot on her website. Richard Longstreth is a professor at George Washington University who has studied Hudson's. He's come to town quite a bit the last decade or so, and then last year he did a book called The Department Store Transformed. And this also has a lot, not only on Hudson's, but also Hudson's warehouses. And then, of course, Macy's recently turned 150, and they've done a real nice book on their history as well. And then, of course, I co-authored a couple of books on the company, too. The first one was Hudson's, Detroit's legendary department store. Then that was followed up with Remembering Hudson's, the Grand Dame of Detroit retailing. And then that was followed up with 20th century retailing in downtown Detroit with a brand new chapter on Hudson's. Plus you also get Crowley's, Kearns, Christie's, Woolworths, Hughes and Hatcher, all the other great stores that we once had. So there's a lot out there. Anybody else have any questions?
Years ago I was at a program and they talked about J.L. Hudson's, and one of the people that were sitting in the audience, they had their mother's charge card, the plastic, and at that time he said that hang on to that because that was worth over $125.
Yeah, periodically you'll see the charged coins on eBay, which were the brass little coins that you saw in the video. Crowley's also had those too for a number of years. You'll also, Kearns had spoons for like several of their anniversaries through the years.
A question a little different, being a cook. Whatever happened to the Hudson's recipes for the things that they were so well known for?
Well, you can still buy the Maurice dressing. And the stores that still have restaurants. Okay. Actually, there is, Marshall Fields produced a cookbook in 2006. It's oversized, it's hardcover. And it's got all the recipes from Dayton's, Hudson's, and Marshall Fields through the years, including Maurice and Canadian cheese soup. But a lot of those things are still with us too. Mandarin chicken salad, popovers, you know. The stores that still have restaurants like Oakland, Somerset, Lakeside, Southland, Westland, and 12 Oaks still serve a lot of those dishes. You know, in certain stores that still have like a deli and whatever, you can buy the Maurice, you know, in the jar. Like even if they just have like marketplace to go, like Eastland and Northland. A lot of restaurants have added Maurice to their menu, but a lot of them don't get it right. You know, if you're a real Maurice aficionado, the lettuce has to be diced. It's got to be julienne ham. The ham and the turkey have got to be diced. There's got to be sweet gherkins, pickles. There's got to be a little bit of lemon juice, a little bit of egg, and the Maurice dressing. Otherwise, you're going to end up with mush. Which I did a presentation, I won't say where, a couple of weeks ago, and they were so proud that this restaurant was catering, and it was billed as a Maurice salad luncheon. And everybody thought it was coleslaw. So you gotta make it right.
It seems we've lost so many of our local names, like Kimmel, Huge Hatcher, I mean, the list goes on and on, classic pickles for one. Do you know that if the Hudson family ever had misgivings about merging the Dayton Corporation, because it seemed like they really got swallowed up, and of course the name disappeared, as eventually Dayton's did too. I'm just curious if you know any background on that.
I don't think there was any misgivings. I mean, the two companies were so alike. I mean, obviously they did not realize the Detroit market would be going through such a drastic change. Loss of population, loss of jobs, income levels not what they used to be. The market share wasn't there anymore. The competition was getting keener. Hudson's was the crown jewel of the company for many, many years. But in later years, the profits just weren't there. I mean, Joe Jr. left the year before downtown closed. He left in '82, downtown closed in '83. He doesn't really like to talk about what happened with the closure of the downtown store. I mean, I think he knew it was coming, but until it actually happens, it hits you in the face, you really don't want to believe it. So, but I don't think there were any misgivings, because the two families had gotten together over the years. There were so many similarities between the two of them. I thought they really thought they could do it, but again, people's tastes change, their shopping patterns change, and they did everything they could to keep that downtown store viable right up until the end. A lot of people only remember it in its grandeur, but I'm telling you, towards the end, I mean, yellow walls, lime green walls. If any of you remember Nice Girl Like You on the 5th floor, where that whole lower section was painted red, the ceilings, the walls, everything. Well, what they were trying to do was get people in a happy mood, even though the walls kept coming in closer and closer. So, and they tried everything they could in terms of special events, and they still kept the windows going and bringing in personalities and stuff, and having clearance corners for value-oriented customers, but it just, no matter what they did, because we kept losing more and more jobs downtown too, and that was a huge problem. And for so many years, they carried the ball for everybody. The downtown Detroit days, all of that sort of thing. And when the foot traffic, because of lack of jobs, stopped, and then you have shoplifting issues. It was a huge place to maintain from a security standpoint. It just, like, so many cards were against it. So, they held on as long as they could. And admirably, they always said, when the doors close, we're not going to tell the media. We're just going to quietly close the doors and give the building the dignity that it deserves, which is what they did. The media kept hounding them. When are you going to close? When are you going to close? There's nothing left. I said, we still see customers. We're still open. And so they quietly closed at 5:45 on January 16th or whatever it was, and that was it.
And I was lucky enough, being a wholesaler in the menswear industry, to sell Hudson's, and I was able to get into the bowels or some of the background offices and things like that. And you talk about the walls coming out. You would take your merchandise up there. We'd get off on Farmer Street, take the elevator up, and go through the back of the store and things like that. And you'd hit this wall, and there would be this expanse of emptiness before you got to the buyer's office. And as a young person, I kind of always thought that was strange. But it was nice to be able to get in and still see the inner workings of the buying and how that worked.
Yeah, a lot of people looked at the building and saw just a big red brick square. But what you didn't see on a lot of the upper floors was intricate brick, a lot of beautiful terracotta in multiple colors, copper, and unfortunately a lot of that went down with the building. Occasionally you'll see some of this stuff in like the Royal Oak Flea Market or the Ann Arbor Antiques Market. You'll see pieces of the building for sale. Or etched glass. New Michelle auctioned off a number of what they could save, the etched JLH on a lot of the windows. And then Chuck Forbes, who owns the Elwood and the Gem and the Century Theaters, also saved a great deal out of the building. He saved part of the marquee, which was all cast iron. He saved some of the windows. And then if you go into the cocktail lounge in the State Theater building, which is now called the Fillmore, some of the plaster from the mezzanine restaurant is in there that he saved. So you'll see fragments around town. Anything else from you, Carrie?
No, I think we're all set. Feel free to browse the archives up here, and Mike's going to hang out and answer any one-on-one questions, I'm sure. We've got Janet in the back with all your Christmas needs satisfied.
Yeah, we've got some books to sell tonight, folks.